suffering in conflict as far as possible. And then the dictums include do not attack those who do not or no longer participate in hostilities, attack combatants only by legal means. Okay. And okay, I think, all right. Treat people under your power humanely and protect and care for victims. It includes principles of distinction between combatants and non-combatants, proportionality of means and methods to reduce unnecessary suffering. So this is basically try to understand the terms. Now, let me go to them. A basic question: can Buddhism join hands with IHL and work for minimizing suffering in war situations? The difficulty involved in giving a plain affirmative answer to this question is the following. The IHL position assumes the existence of war or armed conflict irrespective of the question whether it is justifiable or not. Buddhism seems to share the same difficulty. Now, when I talk about the same difficulty, in fact, I see that both IHL and also religion like Buddhism, both basically would not accept war as a desirable thing. Now, even if you do not accept war as a desirable thing, or in principle you reject war, but still systems have to be realistic and then address the issue. So like in IHL, basically legal position of war is wrong, unacceptable. But at the same time, it talks about reducing suffering. Now, similarly in Buddhism, you can see a similar problem. Now, on the one hand, we can simply say that Buddhism doesn't accept war. But then, how come Buddhism talk about reducing suffering in war or conquering with IHL? I think here it is clear that we have to make finer distinction or finer analysis of the teaching of the Buddha in order to see the situation clearly. Can or does Buddhism accept I'm just trying to get rid of this bar. Sometimes I can't read the last section. I'm sorry.
Yeah, hi, Asanga. Basically, it says, can or does Buddhism accept the possibility of war, and what is the Buddhist response to war?
Okay. That's right. Can or does Buddhism accept the possibility of war? What is the Buddhist response to war? Let me go to the next. In the Samyutta Nikaya Yodhajiva Sutta, the Buddha discourages a questioner who wishes to know whether a soldier killed in the battlefield will be reborn in heaven. Now he asked this question for 3 times, and Buddha says, just forget about it. Don't worry about it, something like that. And finally, when he was pressed for the 4th time, the Buddha responded by saying that such a person with his mind already low, depraved, and misdirected by destructive thoughts will be reborn in the hell. Now here, when you read this discourse carefully, you can see that why a person in the battlefield is reborn in hell, because his mind at that moment is depraved and it is low, and also it is misdirected by destructive thoughts. So as a result of that, he will be reborn. Well, I mean, this answer is interesting. Now you can see that it doesn't really analyzes the war situation as such. Now, if you take simply, you can interpret this sutta as saying, if a person dies with anger, he will be reborn in hell. Now, this is a general, the assumption. I mean, theory in Buddhism. If your rebirth is molded according to your final thoughts, then if your final last thought is anger and hatred, then of course, naturally, your next birth will not be a happy one. So, but here the context is war, but the answer given, we can see that it's a general answer. If a person dies with anger, that person will be reborn in an undesirable place. So, but on the other hand, of course, it doesn't imply that you are engaging in a war with very good mind or something either. So this is a tricky situation. Now, immediate mind of a person can be anger or the violence, but still a person may have a long term or larger intention of causing something good. So in a finer psychological analysis, somebody can say, in the moment of doing something, your mind, actual situation of your mind is anger. But on the other hand, you can also say that larger intention of your action is something more benevolent. Now, for example, we can say something like parents or teachers sometimes punish their children or their students. A practice still you can see in particularly our part of the world, although it is disappearing. Then we always hear that you punish the person or your son or your student not out of anger, but motivated by long-term welfare of that person. I mean, that could be true, but at the same time, you can't really say that when you are actually doing that act of punishment, your mind is very calm and soothing mind. No, actually your mind can be beset with anger at that moment. So I'm making a distinction between the mind or the condition of the mind of the person who is engaged in particular action and the overall mentality or the attitude behind that action. So these are some of the thoughts when I was, reading this sutta that came into my mind, because Buddha doesn't give a direct answer to the question, and also he doesn't make some sort of general statement to the effect that no, the war is unacceptable or something like that. So the sutta is kind of open for interpretation. At the same time, when you read the Sutta Pitaka, both Samyutta Nikaya and Anguttara Nikaya, you can see that there are several Yodha Jiva suttas or suttas that refer to Yodha Jivas. Now, those suttas talk about this simile of Yodha Jiva. Yodha Jiva is translated as the mercenary by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. In fact, Yodha Jiva could also be translated simply as soldier. Soldier in the sense soldier in the battlefield. So now there are several Yodha Jiva suttas among these courses, which refers to various characteristics of, for example, certain sutta refers to some desirable qualities of a Yodha Jiva or the soldier, a soldier, and then Buddha compares those similar qualities of a practitioner, Buddhist monk or nun, whoever is practitioner, who should have similar not identical qualities, but of course parallel qualities in the practice. So in that sense, of course, some kind of positive picture is drawn. But again, of course, that doesn't amount to saying that the Buddha approves of Yodha Jiva's livelihood or anything like that. But basically, in many discourses, you could see this. So let me move into the next one. The historical, now from this doctrinal aspect, the historical practice of Buddhism in Buddhist lands shows that the Buddhist rulers were not hesitant to defend their countries and people even by going for war. Now, I don't think I need to go elaborate into this because the history of traditional Buddhist countries like Sri Lanka, we can see that, there are many situations of rulers going to war. In fact, not only to defend their country against invaders, but of course, there were in Mahavansa, for example, there were many warring situations recorded among the contending the claimants to the kingship. So that we can see that. Then, are these rulers not Buddhist? Should they have refrained from engaging in war at any cost? Now, this is when we think about the ruler waging war, going to protect his own land against an invader. Now, what should be our judgment? Are these rulers not Buddhist? Or if they are really true Buddhist, should they have refrained from engaging in war at any cost? The answer to this question is linked to the general issue of using power force as a means of solving problems. Now, I think this question is a little bit difficult. At this point, I think the Mahasilava Jataka comes into my mind, where hearing that neighboring country ruler is invading his country, the Bodhisattva king advises his ministers not to retaliate. He just get them to sit all around in the assembly around him, and then he keeps discussing Dhamma. Now, of course, unobstructed, the invading ruler comes and get the entire country, including the ministers and the king. And then what the invader did was bury the ruler and the ministers up to their neck, to die like that. So the Jataka story says that in that night, deity, who was a past relative of the king, came and saved the king and the ministers, and finally also regained the kingdom. But the story, according to my understanding, is great. But what worries me is, the ending of this story, how the king was saved and how he regained his the kingdom. In a way, this I say tricky situation, because you can say that the king was behaving perfectly in a Buddhist way, but then, of course, end result is that he and his people were buried to the neck, so that they left, and then a divine power comes and saves them. But is this the Buddhist answer? When I read this story, my mind always. So then, in my less serious mood, I tend to say something like that. To all these modern or Buddhist rulers of Buddhist countries, the deities or the divine beings will not come to save them all the time. So I don't think this can be considered to be the real Buddhist answer, because it contains some kind of irony, because ultimately, you are saved by divine power. So if you rely on divine power, then you practice this. I mean, you act in a perfectly Buddhist way, or otherwise, what is your situation? So, in other words, this the whole issue is somewhat tricky. Now, looking to answer this question, I say that is linked to the general issue of using power or force as a means of solving problem. The debate whether Buddhism allows war or using force power is a result of, now I say that not making a sufficient distinction between two modes of life and two modes of practice associated with those modes of life, namely the monastic life aiming exclusively at nirvana and the household life aiming at nirvana only as the final goal of a life lived in the samsara, enjoying divine and human happiness. I think I don't need to go into details of this distinction I'm referring here. All of us who are familiar with Buddhist studies, we know that there are two modes of life for the monastics and the household. Again, I would like to say that the distinction I am making is not, I mean, it's more of a ideal situation, because this kind of distinction has the questionable assumption that monastics are always for nirvana and households are always for samsara. I think we know that this is not exactly the case, particularly if you take the monastic life in today's context. Not that the monastics have given up their nirvanic ideal, but they are also living a life in the samsara, but we can say that they are somewhat higher than, of course, the household people, but they are not like 24-hour meditators or something who do not have any goal other than that ending nirvana. No, I mean, many monastics in today, they engage in social service and many other activities while being focused on their goal. So so this has to be understood somewhat carefully. And also we can see householders sometimes they assume more monastic type of life. I think this phenomenon has been discussed by many sociologists and the students of Buddhist sociology. So I don't need to go into details of that. But basically, these two ways of life: Buddhist monastic life, basically aiming at nirvana, and the household life, living life in the samsara. Now, I think the two groups of people have two different ways of behavior. But the difference, I would say, is not a matter of kind, but a matter of degree. I think we are again familiar with this very well-known simile that comes in the Sutta Nipata, where the Buddhist, the monastic practitioner is compared to a swan, pure, simple, and fast. And then Gihi, or the householder, is compared to a peacock, very colorful, very vibrant, but of course very slow in flying. Now, this is the simile given. So in other words, the monastic is simple and fast. A householder is more elaborate and ornate and but slow in the practice. So this is basically the idea. I'm sorry, I think so. Anyhow, now so this basic distinction is there. Now, if we make this basic distinction, I think we can see also in the distinction in psychology and also in practice. For example, punya, accumulating punya, is given as the main goal of the Buddhist lay life or household life. Now, another distinction of kusala and akusala: skillful wholesome thoughts and unwholesome thoughts seem to be more related to the monastic life. Again, the distinction I'm making is kind of misleading, because we have to know that even in the ancient history, we see Buddhist monks also engaging in meritorious deeds. So I don't mean that meritorious deeds are only for the lay people. But on the other hand, if you are a person who is really intent on the nirvanic goal, of course, then meritorious deeds would take you back to samsara, although those actions would make samsara more comfortable. It would still keep you in the samsara. So in that sense, the ideal nirvana seeker will not be really rejoicing meritorious deed for the sake of meritorious deed, because it prolongs samsara. So then they would be more to the kusala. Now, when we say kusala, we know that kusala is basically defined as something, the thought or the thought process without attachment, aversion, and ignorance, lobha, dosa, moha. Now, when you look at this point from that angle, we can see that in our household life, in ordinary life, many of the things we do actually come under akusala. So here we need to make a distinction between papa and akusala. So what I'm trying to say is actually all akusalas are not papa. Now, whenever I see something delicious to eat, I get my mind, which you can say is akusala. But of course, by eating a chocolate, you are not committing a papa. So there, this is the kind of distinction I would like to make. So the ideal nirvana seeker will be more intent on, the guarding the mind from akusala. But for the ordinary people, it will be more towards the the punya and the papa. I'm sorry, my PowerPoint disappeared.
Can you not see the slide, or is it just the last one? The last line you can't see? It looks as if Professor Asanga has lost the connection actually with the meeting. While he's trying to come back in, sorry, I'm Kate Crosby intervening here. Perhaps I could just introduce the other people you can see who are visible. So Andrew Bartlett-Smith, could you give us a little wave there on your screen? Peter Harvey, also maybe you could give us a little wave. So this topic is part of a project that Andrew Bartlett-Smith from the International Committee of the Red Cross set up, looking at the interface between Buddhism and international humanitarian law. Peter Harvey has also been involved in this project. So there was a conference held last September in Sri Lanka on the subject, for which Peter was the lead author. And that's hopefully going to be coming out in Contemporary Buddhism later this year. And we also had a lot of papers that people presented that actually brought out really interesting correlations between Buddhism and international humanitarian law, some of which actually brought ideas of ways of enhancing international humanitarian law from Buddhism. And Andrew, I don't know if you'd like to say a few words. You're on mute at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Yes, I mean, we in the International Committee of the Red Cross were very curious about exploring correspondences between Buddhism and international humanitarian law. We'd seen that in the humanitarian field, a lot was done in relation to Buddhism, such as Buddhism and conflict, such as its use for conflict resolution, mediation, conflict prevention. But we saw that not a lot seemed to be done about looking at how Buddhism might help reduce suffering during conflict. And this is, of course, very much the mandate of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Yeah, we are the upholders to some extent of international humanitarian law, the law of conflict, the law of war. And we wanted to see how Buddhism can perhaps contribute to both to promoting adherence to international humanitarian law, but also to see how Buddhism could help reduce conflict on its own terms. Of course, Buddhism's been around much longer than IHL. It's been dealing with conflict ever since the time of the Buddha, and it's never shied away from it. And the remarkable thing I think that we found was that there are many things that resonate between international humanitarian law and Buddhism. This emphasis on minimizing suffering as far as possible, this very pragmatic and realistic approach that it has. Accepting the reality of conflict, without condoning it, and adopting very sober means and very realistic means to try to contain it. So there have been some fascinating papers that came out of the conference, and we're very excited about what we want to do with this. And not only are Buddhist principles very interesting in relation to IHL, but of course Buddhism has all these mindfulness technologies and meditation techniques, which are also highly relevant, because combatants who must adhere to international humanitarian law, they must make sure that as far as possible they don't target non-combatants, etc., that they're not responsible for violations. These techniques can help combatants to have a better awareness perhaps of the battle phase, to better control their emotions, to be better prepared to deal with these situations. And I think by stress testing Buddhism in these very extreme circumstances, I think what we've found is that it's more than adequate to tackle many of the problems, many of the challenges that the ICRC is currently facing. So maybe I'll just leave it at that for the time being. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Professor Asanga, are you back with us and able to continue?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well. And see you now. That's very nice. So it sounds like your connection went. Well done for coming back. Yeah. We just had a little bit of introduction to the project from Andrew, and just talking about the publications. But we're all set for you to go back to your slide if you can see it.
Okay. All right. Was I clear in my the expressions before? I mean, could you hear it? Because I didn't. Didn't notice any.
Yes, we could hear you loud and clear.
Okay. So let me continue, and so the Buddhist monks and nuns are prohibited from, let alone engaging in war, even talking about kings and their wars. We know about it. In the Vinaya, in the defeat involving killing a human being, Manusa Vigraha Parajika, a monk who asks the executioner to kill a victim quickly so that his pain will be minimal, he was found guilty of violating the defeat. Now, again, this is a very, very subtle and tricky case. The monk really, what he asked from the executioner was kill him as quickly as possible. But it was interpreted to be asking to kill somebody. On the one hand, we know that, of course, the killing was determined as a punishment by somebody else, but still the monk's involvement was understood to be something unwarranted or not permissible for a monk. Now, this brings into a very another very tricky question under this ruling. Can a monk with higher admission of Sampada be involved in minimizing suffering in a war situation? Now, this I put as a question to be reflected further. I'm not going to discuss this question in this context, but this is a question somebody can ask the moment you are talking about minimizing suffering. Of course, minimizing suffering not amount to, we can interpret as not amount to, it doesn't amount to killing a person. But of course, the Vinaya Pitaka incident was, it was the case of not really preventing killing, but killing so that the pain will be minimum. So I think there are two issues involved. But basically, we can look at this question further. In IHL situation, we are trying to minimize suffering of war, but not necessarily something as we find in the Vinaya Pitaka. But anyway, I am leaving that to be, if we want to discuss further some other context. Let me move into the next one. Contrary to the situation of the monks and nuns, it is understood that lay people live a different form of life with different immediate goals. Theirs is samsaric life with punya and papa or kusala, and not necessarily with kusala. I mean, the point I discussed earlier. A Buddhist Jataka literature provides many examples of how Bodhisattva kings ruled righteously, but not totally, abstaining from the use of force. So the use of force has been accepted. Then the ideal Buddhist ruler, the universal monarch, who is a righteous ruler, Dhammiko Dhammaraja, has his 4 armies: horses, elephants, armed vehicles, and infantry. Although he would not use them, it is clear that this concept retains the idea of power as a requirement in statecraft. Now, again, here we can see some kind of, I would say, compromise. On the one hand, if you are a ruler, you have to have, physical power, which other people see and other people take into consideration. So the righteous ruler or universal monarch, Raja Chakravarti, he has this fourfold army. Now, coming to the specific issue of use of power force in Buddhism, Abhayaraja Kumara Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya has a story of Abhayaraja Kumara, who had on his lap his small child, and then Buddha asked, what would he do if a fishbone or something gets stuck in this infant's throat? And then the Abhayaraja Kumara answers, saying that out of my love for the child, I will take that out, even if it causes pain and bleeding. So this is the answer. And then Buddha uses this answer to say that at some time Buddha would use harsh words. Now, of course, in this particular context, again, it is nothing like war. What the Buddha says is he would use harsh words. But the question of whether he would do harsh deeds has not been raised. But again, some sort of physical punishment, particularly for the novices, are recorded in the Buddhist monastic tradition. But here the context is much more the simpler context of using harsh words. But the simile or the example discussed is clearly involving a physical force, some kind of violence in that sense, but violence motivated out of compassion. And then another very interesting story is the Vinaya Pitaka story of the 2 misbehaving monks, Assaji and Punabbasu. Now, the case here is Buddha asks Sariputta and Moggallana to go and bring back the other monks who have been misdirected by these two people. And then the monks complain that, the warn, saying that these two people are very rowdy and misbehaving. So they would really, indication is now physically attack Sariputta and Moggallana, although it is not said that. Then the Buddha's answer is, don't go all by yourself, go with the group, parisa. Now, what do you have to have a parisa? What do you have to have a group? Now, again, we can see that when you go with a larger group, with a lesser group, of course, there is implication of, you are indicating that you are you have more power. So now, Assajipunabbasu as followers of the Buddha were not the ideal followers. They were really depraved type of people. Then, but here Buddha says that, well, in order to put the things right, you will have to at least give an indication of power. Now, these are interesting stories which indicate that the use of power has not been altogether, denied, even in the Buddhist monastic context. So that is the implication of this story. Let me move into the next one. It appears that in Buddhism, there is not a fully spelled out system of ethics related to war as IHL does. But given that Buddhism accepts the reality of war, it may well concur with the conventions developed by IHL. Now I am here moving to somewhat, another matter related to this. Buddhism doesn't discuss this in detail. Buddhism doesn't discuss war in detail. So why one answer can be like Buddhism, okay, they denies the war, reject the war. So therefore, there was no need to discuss it in detail. Now, this is one answer. But of course, I don't think it is a very, very, quite successful answer, because, if war is a situation, there must be a discussion in Buddhism on that. For some reason or other, we don't get too much of a discussion, but discussions are there here and there. So one issue is, there are no specific issues discussed related to war and prisoners of war and many other things. But on the other hand, now if a particular thing is right thing to do, now of course Buddhism doesn't have an problem of adopting those whatever the right, the correct traditions developed by others. Now, in order to establish that, I'm using this concept of Maha Apadesa. Any statement that agrees with the Dhamma and the Vinaya may be accepted irrespective of its source. Now, I can consider this as a very important doctrinal matter in Buddhism. Broadly speaking, it says that right thing, whatever it is, its source could be, is acceptable to the Buddhist tradition. So the whole idea is that if something is acceptable, agrees with what the Buddha says, then of course you accept that. So this Mahapadesa criterion, there are different Mahapadesa criteria, but this is basically the criteria that comes in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, Digha Nikaya. So that is one way to justify you accepting IHL as agreeing with Buddhism. What I'm saying is this, simply because Buddhism doesn't discuss this, I don't think the Buddhists should not be engaging in the conversation. They can. So if they in principle accept that reducing war is a good thing, then of course if there are no no guidelines developed in Buddhism, then you accept where the guidelines have been developed. Now another the reason to accept this is idea that everything well said is the word of the Buddha. Sabbang subhasitang tassa bhagavato vachanang eva. The concept, what is well said, Subhasita, has to be understood in the context of the ultimate Buddhist goal of making and end suffering. So whatever that agrees with that is agreeable to Buddhism. So IHL conventions may be accepted on the grounds that they are conducive for minimizing human and animal suffering and also damage to the environment. Let me move to the next one. So same point, Buddhism has not developed as IHL does specific conventions relevant to such as the following: care for the wounded, the sick, the protectorless, the distressed, the displaced, prisoners of war, and surrendered by enemy soldiers, and protection of property, environment, and animals. Now there are, for example, Boja Janiya Jataka, where Bodhisattva is born as a horse. The horse advises his king not to harm the enemies who were captured. But again, in the Jataka literature itself, you don't find too many stories of this sort. So what I'm trying to say is Buddhism has not developed that much, elaborate ethics on these things. So the Buddhist ethics related to this has to be developed, has to be obtained by applying the broader principles of Buddhism, so that Buddhism may incorporate these things. Let me move into the next one. While accepting IHL conventions, each of these matters may be supported with reference to the fundamental ethical principles of Buddhism, such as, again, I'm not going to detail on these things, we can discuss if you want, the 5 moral principles, Panchasila, the 4 sublime state, Metta, Karuna, Mudita, Upekha, friendliness, compassion, and so on. 10 royal virtues, Dasaraja Dharma, that's coming again in the Jataka literature, about the virtues of the good king. Also categories such as good and bad, and wholesome and unwholesome. Okay. Now moving to the conclusions. The monastic position of total dissociation from woe cannot be taken as the Buddhist position of woe. Of course, I'm also questioning sometimes I see categorical statement, we are talking about the Buddhist position of woe. So what I'm saying is we can't talk about something called the Buddhist position. The lay life in Buddhism, one mixed with punya and papa, cannot be totally free from desire, hatred, and delusion. Use of force, power with right intention is acceptable to Buddhism. Into the concurring with IHL for reducing suffering does not contradict either the teaching or the historical practice of Buddhism. Sorry. Conventions of IHL for minimizing suffering may be supported with reference to the fundamental ethical principles of Buddhism. Okay. Now, this basically brings in the conclusion to my presentation. I think by way of summarizing, what I'm trying to say is, now basically when you say we have a very widespread position attributed to Buddhism, that Buddhism is completely against war. What I have been trying to do in this presentation is, somewhat difficult task of, arguing against this position. In order to argue against this position, I'm using this distinction between monastic life and the household life. So in the household life, the distinction I'm trying to make is this. In monastic life, we are trying to completely get rid of lobha dosa moha. In household life, of course, you are dealing with lobha dosa moha. You are making use of lobha dosa moha to certain extent. You are making use of them. So it looks even contradictory, at some point. But of course, we know that it's not contradictory, but simply because simply the Lobha Dosa Moha play a pivotal, particularly at least Lobha Dosa, play a pivotal role in the lay life. So when you get your education, in order to get a good job, when you earn money, when you develop personal relations with the opposite sex, raise children, all these things, we can say that in a way akusala, or motivated by lobha and dosa. Now, of course, moha, we can say that if you have added to that, wrong attitudes and know that, then again moha is also there. Now what I am trying to say is, argue is that in such a way of life, and particularly when the everybody is under the sway of lobha and dosa. Now how to be Buddhist at that situation? Now here the idea is that to understand being Buddhist in degree wise. But I think for some people, being Buddhist means either you be Buddhist or you not be Buddhist, which is like more like Aristotelian, either something is black or something is not black. But I think in the Buddhist tradition, we cannot understand this as something like through bivalent logic. Because being a Buddhist can be, in a way, being a Buddhist, of course, ideally, if you take being a Buddhist as a nirvana seeker directly, and then from that definition, we can say that somebody can be a Buddhist for about 70%, 80%, 90%, which is very good. But what about the people who are Buddhist for 60%, 50%, and then, of course, going below even 40% and so on. So I believe that there is not a point that, of course, very difficult to, hard to find the point, okay, beyond which you are not a Buddhist. There can be certain situations, of course, we have to discuss that in finer details. But basically, the being Buddhist is something to do with degrees. Now, household life is something like that, particularly when you are a ruler. So how are you going to protect your kingdom? Now, when you become a ruler, you have a promise to the subjects or your people that you provide the safeguard and the protection of those people. Now, in such situations, what should the Buddhist ruler do? Now, if you take the historical practice, then Buddhist rulers have gone for war. At least I would say here that according to, being true to their Buddhist upbringing, Buddhist rulers have, in ideal situation, they have not initiated war. But when war is initiated by other parties, basically for self-defense, self-protection, they have gone for war. And also, it looks like that they have gone for war in order to, on deterrent perspective, to threaten people to be in the right mode of their behavior. So the point I am trying to drive in at is, if we really adopt a position that war is completely out of the question in Buddhism, then I would say that there's no point talking about IHL and Buddhism. Because in order to reduce suffering in war, I think it is plain, we basically accept the possibility of war. So I don't know whether I'm communicating, really making myself very clear, but the whole point is that in a world where Lobha Dosa Moha play a pivotal role, the way to adhere to the teaching of the Buddha has to be by stages and also being gradual. Now, the whole point of being gradual, Anupubba Sikha, the gradual training, is that you can't be 100% whatever you are trying to be at the very beginning. So, and in the Buddhist tradition, particularly in the sansaric existence, we have understood that we have to complete paramitas not within one life, but I mean, I'm not giving an argument here to postpone things, but what I'm trying to say is that life is such, the world is such, we have to do certain things gradually. So in that sense, minimizing suffering, reducing suffering gradually in war and in all the other situations is acceptable to Buddhism. So this is the basic matter I wish to argue and I wish to discuss in this presentation. So I think I would stop at this point and open for discussion. And I know that also Andrew has something to add to this. So please go ahead.
Yes, I mean, I've already said something, so perhaps maybe I'll leave it to Kate or P to moderate. I can add some more, but I know Peter Hart is here as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Asanga, for a very lovely talk. Normally, we'll have Angela chairing any questions. Peter, would you like to say anything about the project or the findings before we turn to general questions? Thank you, everybody, for your patience. We're going slightly over, but I think we'll continue for about 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, as you explained, the kind of broad position paper, which I edited, plus various other people, will be in Contemporary Buddhism, and we're hoping to get many of the papers published in a special issue of Journal of Buddhist Ethics, hopefully, and then a book. One kind of point which came to me thinking about this is to get things a bit more real, given that Buddhist countries have been involved in war and conflict recently, but Myanmar, Sri Lanka, to what extent is there any tradition of within those countries of criticizing how a country's army has been behaving when they cross IHL lines and start being cruel and abusive, etc. To what extent is debate, public debate, and voices expressed to raise these issues? That's just a question, really.
Peter, to get the question more clear, so you take this more recent incidents in countries like Myanmar and Sri Lanka, and so your question is how are there any historical guidelines, or is that what you were looking at?
Not, well, perhaps historical guidelines, but actually more contemporary debate and raising these kind of issues, or whether have they just been glossed over and ignored?
In fact, looking at what is happening in the traditional Buddhist countries now, for example, if I take the case of Sri Lanka, which I know little better than the case in Myanmar. In Sri Lanka, we know that the war, that persisted for 3 decades in Sri Lanka. The position of the Buddhist monks was very interesting. On the one hand, the popular idea was they were supporting war, but the support of war, this idea has to be understood very carefully, because the Buddhist monks were very careful in, not saying that, the government should go for war, go for killing, the so-called enemies. And so they are, in their language, they were very careful. But on the other hand, they always looked at the problem. Okay, the religion, the Buddhism is at, the danger here, endangered. So the protect Buddhism is the duty of the ruler. So they were putting it always from that point of view. Not that they should go to the war and kill and all this. But again, you can ask, then of course when you say that you have to protect Buddhism, how are you going to protect Buddhism other than going to war and killing them or something? So that implication. But I'm making a distinction between how they articulated their, concept basically. There may have been, the solitary, variant voices, but basically the overall position of the Buddhist monks was that. So in that sense, they look this as more of a threat to the Buddhism, and then Buddhism has to be protected. Now, again, in order to understand this mentality, of course, I'm not using the mentality to justify whatever they did or did not. But on the other hand, to understand the situation, there were many imagined and the real reasons behind this whole mentality. Now, the idea that Buddhism will be destroyed, or destroyed one day, and then idea that Buddhists are less powerful, with the vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So all the others are up in arms to destroy this religion, that sort of thing. And also, in particularly in Sri Lanka, coming from last 500 years of colonial rule, which really went, against Buddhism. So, all these historical, cultural factors come into mind, forming the Buddhist position. So within that, I think...
Could I just respond at that point?
Yes, please, go ahead.
I wasn't actually asking about, as such, monastic voices, although they could be part of it. In a sense, your response implies that there were no non-monastic civic debate about these issues.
No monastic?
It seems like that. And also there's the issue of whether in so-called protecting Buddhism, one should always look at the danger from within the Buddhist community, that if you act very much sometimes against Buddhist values, that is a danger to Buddhism. That can be the case, surely.
Well, Peter, again, I think it depends on the position we are looking at. Now, as I try to indicate in my the earlier discussion, now in Mahasilava's case, in the Mahasilava Jataka, you can say that the king was being perfectly according to the the Buddhist virtues.
That's the extreme of complete non-violence. That's one end.
Yeah.
The other end, in the middle somewhere, is using violence in a measured way, and then the other extreme is using violence in a very unmeasured way. So surely we have to talk about the middle situation.
Yeah. Actually, Peter, this middle way is very slippery. It could go either this way or that way. But I mean, that's very important observation, because now using force and power in acceptable manner, I think that was very much a concern in these situations, at least particularly in Sri Lanka, because the whole idea was that you don't initiate war. You don't really go against these people if they don't come into war. But if they come to destroy you, then of course you do something to protect yourself. But whether these were harsh or whether these were, the debate on the degree is, I would take it to be more personal and subjective way to look in that. There can be certain things we can describe to be extreme cases or less extreme cases. But what I would like here is, basically there are situation in, at least in Sri Lankan context, where the Buddhist, particularly the Buddhist monks, of course there were one or two monks who were composing songs in support of things like that, which are discussed more in the international literature and the media. But there are thousands of other monks, actually larger majority of the monks, who did not really like this whole thing called war or this violence. But of course, ultimately they had made up their mind to accept, some kind of inevitable, some kind of necessary violence or something like that, even though it was not articulated in that exactly in the same manner. So in that sense, I mean, I'm seeing here a struggle. The point I'm trying to make is, as response to you, is not to defend, necessarily not to defend, but to see how the people were struggling between, I mean, being Buddhist and at the same time being pragmatic and realistic and making a situation. There may have been certain things, which we may say, no, this is a violation of Buddhism or something. But on the other hand, the fact that we cannot deny is that these people were trying to be Buddhist. They had this concept in their mind. They were thinking that how to make this, how to be Buddhist and still, try to safeguard. So maybe they were not always right or did it in the right manner. But at least I think we need to credit them with the intention and their effort. It's not like they were all out for, the killing all, the so-called thing. I don't think that was the situation.
Yeah, but just again, a final question: has there been any debate in Sri Lanka after the end of the war about whether there were violations of international human law and Buddhist principles? For example, a thing came up in the international media about whether there was indiscriminate bombing of collections of civilians. I'm not saying there was or wasn't, but there was something there to investigate. Has there been any debate about it?
That's very interesting. As you know, this debate and international inquiry and these discussions go on, and particularly from if you are asking whether the Buddhists had any debate or any discussions about these so-called violations, what I see is actually now ordinary Sri Lankan, the Sri Lankans' perception is there was a war, and also the army was still trying to save these, the people who were taken captive by other forces. So that was the perception, as ordinary Sri Lankans we get, of course, from the media and, sources. Some of the media were government run, of course. So for the, unless for a specialist, ordinary people, both monks and nuns, in Sri Lanka are with the understanding and the impression that the Sri Lankan army was trying to do its best to minimize killing and safeguard the people who were stranded, who were taken captive. So this is the basic understanding of Sri Lankan people. So as a result, I don't see really among the Buddhists, in particularly a debate whether this kind of the violation of law or atrocities committed purposely on particular group of horse taking.
Thank you, Professor Asanga, Professor Harvey. I'd like to open it up, if I may, for other questions or any comments for Andrew. And while we're waiting for those questions, so for the questions, please just raise your hand or turn your mic on and interrupt. I just want to draw your attention to the website that's in the chat and which you can see in front of you. So Sri Lanka actually hosted this first conference on this subject. So we had this amazing hosting with the participation of Sri Lankan military, Sri Lankan monastics and legal experts. It was an amazingly productive conference discussing specifically these issues, how to enhance the different ways of reducing suffering actually during war. So please do raise your hand or interrupt. I don't know, Andrew, if you want to make any more comments at this point. So we've not got long, maybe another 5 minutes if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, well, I'll wait for some questions if there are any, but I'd just say an obviously positive experience. I mean, there is a lot of this talk, a lot of the questions that Peter has about what's going on in Buddhist countries now and that sort of thing. But really, what we see is the capability, the capacity of Buddhism to really contribute to reduce suffering during conflict. There was a lot of, we got a lot of support from the monastic community in Sri Lanka, from the military and from others around the world, a lot of interest in this. And for us, it's been an inspiring experience. We've learned a lot. Yeah, our mandate is to promote IHL, but we really do want to learn about what Buddhism has to teach. And the further we go into the texts, and the family texts in particular, it's astonishing how relevant they are to contemporary situations of conflict today. So it's been an enormously positive experience. And I think, and then you have in Buddhism, for example, there's a prohibition on the arms trade, and there are these mindfulness dimensions, psychological insights that IHL perhaps doesn't really have. I mean, it's just a system, it's just a regime of law. So we're incredibly excited about the future in this respect and the further research.
Yes, maybe I could just highlight some of the topics that came out of that conference. So we had some very interesting stories taken from places like the Jatakas about the protection of the environment during war, about how best to look after captives in constructive ways, not just to avoid the escalation, but also to prevent recurrence. We had some very interesting papers on reducing sexual violence and the different causes of sexual violence. And cultures of sexual violence. And we had very interesting talks on the use of meditation and whether meditation can actually help break through the fog of war to reduce lack of discrimination between valid and invalid targets, for example. So to enhance the IHL notion of distinction. So there were some really interesting responses, both showing good correlation, but also showing ways of potentially enhancing the maintenance of international humanitarian law during conflict. Are there any questions from our audience? Thank you again for your patience in staying longer.
I would like to ask a question.
Please go ahead.
Professor Asanga, yes. Thank you, Professor Asanga. This is Purva. We met in Pune. And yeah, I would like to ask you, yes, I don't know if you remember. Professor, I would like to ask, well, there are some people who pursue peace studies and conflict studies. And basically, this field, many people are of the opinion that all conflicts are not bad and destructive. We have people like, we have had philosophers like Hegel and Marx who have defended conflict as a necessary instrument of change and even progress. And then there are scholars, sociologists like Simmel and Koser, and they feel that it's a necessary tool for social integration, and even to the extent that conflict prevents the ossification of social system by exercising pressure for innovation and creativity. I have gone through those suttas that you mentioned today during your talk, Yodha Jiva Sutta. I know that there are quite a few varieties of that sutta, but my studies in this field is quite limited. Could you please say something about this whole framework and in the modernistic sense? Could you just give your thoughts?
Okay, you are basically asking about how the conflict and these things can be used in the constructive manner. Is that right?
Yeah. That is the question. Constructive manner. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, the conflicting situation, if you look at the particularly the psychological aspect of that, it is intense working of mind, and also requires a lot of application. And particularly when we look at conflict from a manner that conflict as some kind of vibrant, the psychological engagement and reaction. In fact, you can very well say that conflict can be that state of mind can be used for constructive constructive purposes, particularly when your mind is confronted with certain possible contradictions or dilemmas. I think that is a very good opportunity for the mind to be working very intensely and also looking at matters, very carefully, so that the conflicting situation, particularly in your own mind and also among people, could be used in the constructive manner, so that you can strengthen your inner ability, and also you can engage in the debate and discussion with people. Of course, heated debates and heated discussions, but ultimately producing something positive. So in that, I see this as possibly serving a positive purpose. I don't know whether I answered your question or even came to that.
Professor, are there any suttas which you can remember or you can refer to where Buddha has explicitly stated, that these are the sources of conflicts, and that it can be creative, that sometimes conflict can be creative?
Yeah, actually, there are, I would say, many discourses directly and indirectly dealing with the conflicts, particularly when you look at conflict as ultimately traceable to the inner characteristics of, as I referred to earlier, lobha, dosa, and moha. I think many discourses can be interpreted as discussed in this matter. Now, apart from this broad application of these things, there are discourses like Chula Dukkha Kanda, Mahadukkha Kanda, the talking about how suffering arises, how out of tanha, people go for fighting war, and how kings and rulers and people among themselves fight. So I think if you look from that perspective, the many Buddhist discourses dealing with defilements can be made use of as tools to analyze this. But I'm not at a position to, at the moment, I don't you even expect
Your answer was really
discourses, but
very helpful.
yeah. Okay.
Professor, one last question, if I may. Kate, can I ask one last question?
Please go ahead, Purva.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you. Professor, I was quite, your answer to the last question was quite satisfactory. Thank you. One basic question that always, troubles me is basically in conflict studies, we see that religion is basically one of the major sources of conflict.
Right.
As we see in the world today, we have seen how there were clashes between the Protestant states and Catholic states, and even today we have interreligious conflict, and then all of these things are there. How do we study Buddhism in this framework of what is happening here in the modern world, and how do we study Buddhism as a peaceful religion in this context, even when we see what is happening in Buddhist countries today, as to the treatment of your Rohingya Muslims, or so this was a very basic.
Yeah. But thank you very much. Interesting question. Actually, we know that, look at the history, religions are supposed to be advocating peace, but religions have got involved in warring situations. Now, here, I think the basic confusion we are making is using the term religion without making enough, the precision. Now, religion as a teaching is one thing, religion as organization is another. So, religions as organizations have gone for war. But if you take religions as teaching, it is quite the contrary. Interesting thing is, now, why do religions have this propensity for violence and conflict? I think that is basically a psychological question, because religion is something to do with very deep inner and also utmost important matter, namely one's own survival and liberation. Now, so it deals with something very, very crucial and very, very important. Now, when it becomes so crucial and so important, and people also tend to identify it with themselves, with their self. Now, then it becomes a matter, if somebody talks against your religion, then it becomes something that goes against your own self. So this identification of religion with your own self is the psychological root, as I understand. So that is why you get angry when somebody is, criticizing what you consider to be your religion, which is considered also by you to be the true religion. Now, my answer here is not to, I mean, if you think that your religion is true religion, I don't ask you to not to think so. No, I mean, depending on your purpose, you can see that your religion is the true religion for your purpose. But what I would like to argue for is actually believing in that your religion is true religion. Even other religions are false in that particular perspective. I think that is not the issue. The issue is that if you don't allow false position or false ideas to exist, if you think that only what you consider to be true idea should exist and others should not exist, I think that is where the problem comes. Now, in Buddhism, there are places where Buddha clearly says that this is the only path for attaining nirvana. But of course, if you take the goal as nirvana, then Buddha has said this is the path. But that doesn't mean that other religions are wrong. Other religions may have other goals, and those religions may be good paths for those goals. So if we have, I mean, very broad democratic, so to say, set, I mean, the mind, then of course we can accommodate other things. So in other words, I'm here arguing against a very, I mean, the popular mode. People think that, we should go to some type of relativism, simply because accepting something to be true causes problems. I mean, I don't accept that type of relativism. The position is that you can accept something to be true, but still you can be peaceful with others. I mean, this is the situation. How I look at this problem.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much.
Okay.
There was a lot of information.
Yes, thank you. A very interesting answer. I think we're at the end of our time.